Hello, Packers fans, wherever you may be. It's time for another edition of the Pack Attack Cast for September 23rd, 2025. It is Tuesday, and as usual on Tuesday, we like to take a look at the NFC North as a whole. We're going to take a look at the Packers, the Bryans, the Vikings, and the Bears, and the race for the NFC North Championship. So that's going to be our goal for today. Tomorrow, we're going to start breaking down Packers versus Cowboys and how the Packers can turn things around with a big win on Sunday Night Football. Cross your fingers. But today, we're going to take a look at the NFC North as a whole, get you updated on that. We're going to look at the NFC North standings. We're also going to look at the ESPN Power Rankings and see how things have changed based on week number 3, especially how it involves the Packers and the NFC, and our goal of either, number 1, winning the NFC North so we can host a playoff game, number 2, possibly competing to get that number 1 spot in the NFC North. It's not out of reach. We're only a game behind the number 1 spot in the NFC. Before we get to that, I just want to mention we're at 2,300 subs, and we'd love to get to 10,000 by the Packers bye week. If you can also, if you've already subscribed, give us a like. That really helps the algorithm. And you can follow us on Blue Sky at Pack Attack Cast, just like the name of this show. So let's get to what happened last night. Very disappointed. The Ravens did not do us a favor by beating the Lions. And there were many situations where the Ravens actually made some mistakes that definitely could have. I'm not just talking about play on the field. Obviously, they got beaten by the Lions. But there were some situations where the Ravens left some points on the board that could have resulted in a different outcome last week. But we can't rely on our opponents to beat the rest of the NFC North. It now falls to the Green Bay Packers, and how we can continue to win and lead in the NFC North. So let's take a look at the standings for the NFC North. We have the Green Bay Packers at 2-1 with net points of 20, which is a key tiebreaker. Minnesota Vikings are second in the rankings, 2-1 with 25 net points. The Lions are 2-1 with 25 net points, and the Chicago Bears still suck. They're 1-2 with a negative 17 net points. So we knew the NFC North was going to be very competitive, and that's why winning that game against Detroit was so huge. Because if the Detroit Lions had beaten the Packers, and then say the Packers had beaten the Browns, so basically we trade a win against the Lions for a win against the Browns, and the Detroit Lions would be number 1 in the division. So it's really critical that we got that early win against the Detroit Lions. And I'm starting to feel more and more, if this continues to be such a tight race, that the Thanksgiving game against Detroit in Detroit might end up deciding the winner of this division. Because if the Packers can gear up for that game on Thanksgiving and win that game and get basically a 2-game lead in the division over the Lions, that would really be huge. The alternative, of course, is the Lions even out the series with the Packers, and we're neck and neck. So I'm really going to be watching that very closely. So the good thing that the Packers have right now is their next divisional opponent won't be until week 12. So that gives the Packers 8 weeks to gear up for that game against the Vikings. So what we really want to see the Packers do, obviously, is to not only win the majority of those games, but also see them ramping up and getting better week to week, so that once we get to those divisional matchups at the end of the season, the Packers are in the best possible form. Now, we do have the bye week coming up after the hopeful win against the Cowboys, and that will bring serious reinforcements because we've got players that are probably going to come off of injured reserve and be key players. We're going to have reinforcements at wide receiver. We're going to have reinforcements at running back. We're going to have hopefully some players on the offensive line after the bye week come back healthy, and we can have our offensive line back to 100% again. But what we really need to do for the Green Bay Packers is they need to win on Sunday night. This is a huge game for the Green Bay Packers. They need to go into their bye week 3-1, and the Dallas Cowboys look ripe for the picking. The Dallas Cowboys do not look good at all. They lost to the Eagles, not a surprise. They almost lost to the Giants. That was where I really started to say, wow, the Cowboys could be gotten. And this week, they absolutely got pummeled by the Chicago Bears in a game that wasn't even as close as the score. I rewatched it this morning. That game was not even close. So this is a perfect opportunity for the Green Bay Packers to have a statement game on prime time against the Cowboys. The Packers are better on offense. They're better on defense on Sunday Night Football. This should be an easy win for the Green Bay Packers on the road. They've always played well in Dallas. The Achilles heel for the Packers continues to be special teams. That's what cost them the game against the Cleveland Browns, 100%. Everything else that went wrong against the Browns could have been made better simply by successfully blocking a field goal and getting the Packers the win on a bad loss, on a bad win, but still a win. And we would be 3-0. We'd still have a full game ahead of the Vikings, Lions, and 2 games ahead of the Bears, but that was not to be because special teams really let us down. So let's go through some quick news and notes for the Green Bay Packers. Then we're going to talk about the other teams in the NFC North. Coming on Tuesday, the Packers promoted Bryant Banks from the practice squad to the 53-man roster. They had 2 slots available. Now they have 1. And I think this was a very smart move. And this really tells me the Packers have accepted that Aaron Banks and Zach Tom should not play this week. What I would like to see is Jordan Morgan play left guard, where he has played very well. And also, we're going to have at right tackle Anthony Belton instead of Zach Tom. Zach Tom, I give him credit for trying to play last week, but he was not healthy. The Packers need to manage their O-line better. And what I mean by that is last week they threw Zach Tom in at the last minute. There was Aaron Banks playing, but he wasn't healthy. The Packers are better off making decisions to sit their offensive linemen and have the backups come in and get consistent reps to get ready for this week's game against the Cowboys. I would like the Packers to decide early this week that Aaron Banks and Zach Tom are going to sit and have Jordan Morgan and Anthony Belton getting the reps they need to be effective against the Cowboys. The Cowboys have a very weak defensive line, except for Kenny Clark in the middle. Can't wait to see Kenny Clark again. But that being said, they don't have the penetration on the edges that are really going to be a factor against Anthony Belton. So I think we can live with Andy Belton and Jordan Morgan starting this week. Make the decision early, Green Bay, so those players can be ready for Sunday night. That's my biggest notes. For the Detroit Lions, we have 2 quality wins in a row, and they're back in the hunt in the NFC North. I still feel they have a lack of depth, especially at defensive end, that will catch up to the Lions over time. So This is part of a marathon for the NFC North versus a sprint. And I think the Packers are better situated and insulated with depth to take the season on long term and win the NFC North. But for that to happen, the Lions might have to see some attrition to see some of those areas where they lack depth really become a problem. I'm also very interested to see the Detroit Lions play the Cleveland Browns this week. I want to see how they play against the Cleveland Browns. It'll give us a good measuring stick about how good the Browns defense is and how good the Lions offense is, because we just saw the Packers play the Browns last week. The Browns will be a challenge and might provide some insight on how the Packers could beat the Lions on Thanksgiving, which, as I said, is becoming a more important matchup as the Packers have given up that loss against the Browns. So that's really what I'm watching for the Detroit Lions. Can they show up again on a short week against the Browns and be as effective as they were against the Ravens? Or were the Ravens just a bad defense? So we've seen the Ravens have bad defense 3 weeks in a row. In fact, they set a record for the most points allowed in the first 3 weeks of the season. So were the Lions that good last night, or was the Ravens defense so bad? We're going to have to see if when the Lions go from the worst, possibly one of the worst defenses in the league so far, to the best defense in the league, how that changes their efficiency. So we're going to watch that very closely. Moving on to the Vikings. Vikings rolled in a defensive dominant game against the Bengals this week. Was the Vikings defense that good, or were the Bengals really bad? I watched the replay of that game this morning, and it was pretty much the Bengals turning the ball over left and right, and the Vikings capitalizing on it. Now, I'm not taking anything away from the Vikings defense, but will they continue to be that successful? We know the Bengals have problems at quarterback. They also had a lot of fumbles in that game against the Vikings. Is that an aberration, or is the Vikings defense good enough to carry this team? Carson Wentz was solid with little pressure on his plate because the Vikings defense literally outscored the Bengals in this game. That's how bad this game was for the Bengals. So can Carson Wentz consistently provide solid production when he has pressure to win a game? Carson Wentz is a backup for a reason, and his best days are behind him. Will he continue to be effective, or will he have some challenges? They have a really big game against the Steelers in Ireland this week. How does Carson Wentz do against a high-quality defense? And will that be a big reason that the Vikings either win this week or they lose on the road against the Steelers? This is a really big game for the Vikings. It's a huge road test that will tell us if the Vikings are legitimate or if the win against the Bengals was just a win against the Bengals. Because the Minnesota Vikings have played 12 quarters of football. They've had 5 good quarters and 7 bad quarters in that play from what I've seen. So which Vikings team is it? Is it the team that rolled on the Bengals? Or was it the team that barely beat the Bears? Or was it the team that got a beat down the week before? We're going to have to see what happens with the Minnesota Vikings. Incidentally, Jordan Addison is back after suspension. How does the Vikings offense adjust with the addition of Jordan Addison? What is the pecking order? How does Carson Wentz use these receivers? Carson Wentz also doesn't have a lot of experience with any of these receivers, including Addison. And how does that impact the offense as they play a much tougher opponent this week? We're going to have to watch that very closely. And finally, we have the Bears. The Bears had a nice win over the Cowboys week number 3. Hopefully, the Packers can follow suit. Was this an indictment of the Cowboys or are the Bears turning it around? I watched the tape of the Bears versus Cowboys game this morning. It was very clear to me that the Cowboys are just very bad right now. Very bad. And I think that this is more an indictment of the Cowboys than the Bears getting things together. The Bears have a very winnable game against the Raiders this week. Can they take the momentum of this game and take it into their game against the Raiders? So those are things that I'm watching right now. Last thing I want to do today, and we're going to switch our screen for that, is I want to look at the ESPN's latest power rankings and how the Packers fall into it, as well as a focus on the NFC North. Power rankings are a good way to assess where your team stands right now. They don't predict the future, and sometimes they tend to be focused on the last game more than the last couple games, but I think they're a very useful tool. So let's go ahead and switch over to ESPN's power rankings and take a look at this. So the ESPN power rankings after week 3, we have the Eagles at 3-0. I have to give the Eagles credit for their win over the Rams, but they struggled in this game against the Rams, and this was a very close to an Eagles loss in this game. If the Eagles had lost this game, I think they probably would have fallen to maybe 3 on the rankings. So it's very interesting to see the Eagles pull off a win. Credit to them. And they're up to number 1 per ESPN. Number 2, we have the Buffalo Bills. Again, I think this fits in very well. The Bills are 3-0. They found ways to win close games. They've been very consistent. They do have concerns with injuries. We're going to have to see if those tend to build up. And they still have a very tough schedule. So we'll see how the Bills do. At number 3, we have the Detroit Lions. And I think this is fair. This is very fair. The Detroit Lions are coming off of 2 solid wins. And they dominated the Ravens. And we have to see if the Ravens are just bad or if the Lions were a very good team that beat up an okay team in the Ravens. It's too early to tell. But a win is a win. I think the Detroit Lions deserve to be number 3 on the power rankings after 2 big wins. We have the Chargers at number 4. No argument there. They're solidly in control of their division. And at 5, we have the Green Bay Packers. I actually think this is very generous. I thought the Packers would be maybe 6 or 7 on this list. So the Packers getting number 5 after a bad loss against the Browns actually is heartening for me that things might not be as bad as I felt on Sunday afternoon after that loss. So Green Bay Packers at number 5, I agree. This is about where they should be, but they have destiny in their hands. Can they turn things around and beat the Cowboys this week and get to 3-1 and maybe move up to maybe 3rd or 4th on this list with a convincing win on Sunday night? We have number 6, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Buccaneers, my mind says this is about right because they have lots of injury issues. They're winning ugly, but they're still finding ways to win the game, and you have to give the Buccaneers credit for that. I don't know if it's sustainable because the Buccaneers have a tough schedule coming up, and their injuries are still a long way from getting fixed. So I think the Buccaneers are very solid at number 6. We have the Ravens at 7. I think they should be lower on this list. I would actually put the Rams ahead of the Ravens here. I would put the Ravens probably at 8. So I would flip-flop the Rams and the Ravens here. Let's look at the Kansas City Chiefs. I think this is a legacy selection here. I actually would put the Kansas City Chiefs lower on this list. I would probably put the Kansas City Chiefs probably at number 13 right now if I had to make a quick decision. We've got the Commanders at 10. That's right. 49ers at 3-0. At number 11, this makes sense because their competition has not been that great, and they lost Nick Bosa for the rest of the season, which is a big loss for the 49ers. I don't know if their success is sustainable given their injuries right now. We have the Colts at number 12. That kind of makes sense. The Vikings at 13. I think that makes sense. I'd probably put the Seahawks ahead of the Vikings because of the strength of schedule, but we're nitpicking here. We have the Broncos at 15, Cardinals at 16, Steelers at 17. Just trying to get to the Bears here. Bengals at 20. That's important for the Packers in a couple weeks. And the Chicago Bears at number 23. I think that's about right. We have the Dallas Cowboys at 24. Can the Packers take advantage of a Cowboys team that is not looking very good and win on Sunday? We're going to have to watch that. So on Sunday, we're going to start breaking down Packers news and start breaking down Packers versus Cowboys and how the Packers can have a dominant win to get back on track against the Cowboys. So I'm very excited about this game. So we're going to talk about the Packers versus Cowboys for the rest of the week, as long as updating you with Packers news and notes. So hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you tomorrow.